The War in Heaven, a conflict spanning centuries, millennia, or perhaps no time at all. Fought against an inconceivable enemy, the Time Lords were outmatched by various groups at various points in history. This war echoes the last great Time War, but it could be no more different. A war of fantasy and myth, where cold hard science is disguised by rituals and other primitive cultural practices. The War in Heaven is endless, constantly contracting and expanding outwards to new fronts, due to the nature of its time-active powers. The lesser species had no idea what hit them, as the heavens seemed to fall around them. So what was this conflict made of myth and legend? Well, this is its story. Before we get into the war, due to how history was in flux, many terms were changed. The Time Lords were known as the Great Houses, Gallifrey was known as the Homeworld, and TARDISes were simply time ships. For simplicity, all terms such as these will be changed to what we know them as now, so instead of Great Houses, it'll be Time Lords. That being said, within each of the 6 Time Lord chapters are a network of chapter houses, such as House Lungbarrow under the Prydonian chapter, home of the Doctor. The war is split between 2 perspectives, those from time-active powers that can directly see and feel the effects of the war. Initially, the Time Lords referred to everyone else as lesser species, with the Osirans coming the closest to being seen as equal, but eventually those from New Blood houses started to regard time-active cultures as more equal, and so it's more commonly agreed that the lesser species were those like humanity, the pawns of the war, and the second perspective, who could have their entire timelines rewritten and not notice, as that to them is what always has been and may always will. With that out of the way, on to the war. The Matrix predicted that Gallifrey would survive many attacks before falling in a war against an implacable enemy, but due to the enemy's time-active nature, it couldn't make any concrete predictions. Last Contact was known by Lana to be the event in which the identity of the enemy would become known, essentially confirming the war to exist. Luckily for the Time Lords, the enemy's identity was actually constantly shifting. 1,152 years before the war, irregularities in the Time Lords' breeding engines, evidently including the errant biodata of the other, caused a series of renegade Time Lords to come into existence. These primarily included the 4 that were the Imperator, Grandfather Paradox, the Master, who would later become the War King, and the Doctor. Though highly unreliable about his past, Auteur once suggested that he too was a bit of the other. The mutations in this broken generation brought about the first changes on Gallifrey since its founding. Around the beginning of this generation's era, Avis discovered a remnant of reality from the Dark Times before the anchoring of the thread, and encountered the enemy in the form of Sir Nunos. The Killer Cats of Jin Seng, oracles to the Time Lords, began going into hiding in fear of the future. The cultural void left by their absence came to be filled by insane and renegade members of the Time Lords. Around 880 years before the war, the Imperator attempted to prepare Gallifrey for conflict by starting the Catharian Imprimatur and founding the Order of the Wheel to be led by his cousin Thessalia. The Imprimatur produced 8 Babels, but it was ended when one Babel slaughtered House Catharian. It was imprisoned under the Order's headquarters in House Ixion, where Thessalia consulted with it about the upcoming war. 453 years before the war, one of the other broken children founded House Paradox, taking on the title of Grandfather Paradox. The next year, the unrest reached its zenith as a deranged renegade, the Decayed Master, murdered the sitting president through the agency of Chancellor Goth, with that holder of the title having been the last normal figurehead president after other leaders began to exhibit more individual initiative. The bookworm regarded this event as how the war started. This meant that from a certain point of view, the murder of Koloth, eons prior, which had been key to the now Chancellor's political rise, had been the unwitting cause of the war, having occurred in the aftermath of the War Chief incident. About 400 years before the war, Greyjan the Sane served as Lord President of Gallifrey for 3 years. In that time, he foresaw the war and made plans for 9 copies of Gallifrey to be created through cryptoforming. After predicting that the enemy would be ancestor cells, he committed suicide. 396 years before the war, during Greyjan's presidency, the newly formed House Paradox negotiated with the British government in 1752 to obtain the 11 days lost when the British converted to the Gregorian calendar. These days formed the 11-day empire. The Gazetteer considered the negotiations to be humanity's first official involvement in the war. At the time of the calendar changeover, the 11th Day Empire was witnessed by many Londoners, including Sabbath Day, a future wartime participant. 392 years before the war, Cardinal Thorak attempted to establish a power base on Dronid to overthrow the High Council. The council responded with an attack of ignorance, simply ignoring him, and Thorak was dragged back to Gallifrey, leaving behind Time Lord technology on Dronid. In the aftermath of the Dronid event, other potentially dangerous renegades were imprisoned, including Grandfather Paradox. The enemy initially blocked off chunks of history to prevent War-era Gallifrey from contacting pre-War-era Gallifrey to prepare them for the war, but as the war progressed, the walls between the pre-war and the War-era thinned. 380 years before the war, agents of the Order of the Wheel encountered wartime members of Faction Paradox through a breach in the protocols of linearity caused by a violent unknown event on Zola Domini. Frightened that the Babel's previously unconfirmed predictions appeared accurate, Thessalia travelled to a planet on the frontier in time and released the Babel, theoretically under her control. However, it overpowered her and escaped to 17th century Earth, where it planned to convert humanity's history into a weapon against the enemy. About 155 years before the war, the idea of hybridization began to emerge on Gallifrey. The Time Lord's TARDISes began changing in a manner similar to evolution. One TARDIS, Lolita, had the Master modify her so that she could become humanoid. At a time closer to the war's beginning, Lolita met with her sister, the Doctor's TARDIS, on the forest world of Dust, and tried to convince her to join Lolita in preparing for the war. About 150 years before the war, the rationality of the universe was briefly threatened by the Carnival Queen, a pre-anchoring being with a goal identical to the enemy's, to return to reality to as it was before the Time Lords imposed their web of time onto it. The Carnival Queen was stopped by the Seventh Doctor, Chris Quedge, and Ros Forrester, but not before Gallifrey was momentarily plunged into chaos. In that time, the recently elected Leni Romana had an epileptic fit and released 300 prisoners from Sharda, including Grandfather Paradox, who went on to make Faction Paradox a major power in time for the war before erasing himself from history. Romana's presidency brought many changes to Gallifrey and stirred the stagnant culture. David Foreman, a Time Lord from this era, was one of the many notably influenced by this liberalism. During her presidency, however, the Dalek Empire launched its first invasion of Gallifrey through the Etra Prime incident. Kellen cited the incident as the event which first foreshadowed the war, signalling that the Time Lords would need to abandon the non-interference policy and fight to keep control of the cosmos. According to the Book of Lies, after President Romana's reconciliation with the Sisterhood of Khan, Rassilon made a deal with Faction Paradox to undo the changes and restore his preferred order to Gallifrey by manipulating the timeline of the newly regenerated Eighth Doctor. Subsequently, the Eighth Doctor was uncertain if Romana or Flavia was president. When the closed session occurred roughly 75 years before the war, Gallifrey was led by a nondescript and stagnant presidency. 36 years before the war, the future War King returned to Gallifrey with knowledge of the enemy. This time he was listened to, largely because of the President's attempt to prove that the enemy didn't exist, the faraway declaration, resulting in the first message from the enemy which came with the President's severed head. Umbast then assumed the presidency. Around 20 years before the war, the Celestial Intervention Agency removed themselves from history and became the Celestis to avoid the coming conflict. In the first explicit encounter between humanity and one of the major wartime powers, the Celestis realm of Mixtlan was accidentally summoned to the town of Gragov by Vlad III's creation of the Forest of the Impaled in 1461. When all possible timelines began to be destroyed by Randolph Bane's abuse of the Doctor's Amaranth, the universe's higher powers refused to do anything because they were focused on preparing for some imminent big war, leaving it to be fixed by Chris Quedge, Bernie Summerfield, and the Shirin Dream crew. When it became clear that war was inevitable, Greyjan the Sane's plan for the 9 Gallifreys was implemented. Each of these duplicates thought that it was the original, and all of them had the ability to make even more copies of themselves. Each Gallifrey was a sheath echo of one core probability, with similar attributes but more often with different histories and rulers. One Gallifrey was led by Umbast and the future War King. Romana's presidency continued on a clone world Gallifrey located in Kasterborous that believed that it was the original, creating 8 clone worlds of its own. Around 10 years before the war, Faction Paradox was freely peddling time travel technology to the lesser species. They had also chosen a homeworld for themselves, which they thought their blood rights were protecting from the Time Lords. However, the High Council wiped out most of their homeworld, as well as the faction colonies on Dronid and elsewhere. The leaders of the faction escaped to the 11th Day Empire, which became a community for the first time. Cousin Shankaka, carrier of Grandfather Paradox's shadow, believed herself to be the last scion of the faction homeworld. After the destruction of their homeworld, the faction began infiltrating cultures throughout the universe, setting up cults and secret societies like the Order of the Rectangle, the Cult of the Black Sun, and the Luminous, so they could secretly give time travel technology to the lesser races. Supreme Order of the Rectangle member Robert Hay would later orchestrate the Gunpowder Plot in hopes of putting the Brotherhood in charge of Great Britain. The Luminous ruled multiple planets for centuries, including Oloril and Argos, and the Order of the Black Sun would go on to wage a time war against Rassilon and the early Gallifreyans. The faction also started creating the Remote in various post-human colonies, including Ordifica. 6 years before the war, Umbast died and the War King became the official head of his Gallifrey. About 2 years before the start of the war, the Eighth Doctor, already aware of the coming conflict from having encountered it in his past, took on Compassion, a Remote from Anathema, as a companion. While travelling with the Doctor, Compassion absorbed signals from the Doctor's TARDIS and was transformed into the first and only Type 102 TARDIS. The Time Lords sought to capture Compassion so that she could be the mother of a new generation of Type 103 TARDISes for the war. The War King's homeworld was unsuccessful in doing so, but Romana III's Gallifrey, already heavily affected by future war events, was. Before this Gallifrey could be devastated by the enemy at the start of the war, it was erased from history during Faction Paradox's invasion of Gallifrey, coming from near to the end of the conflict. Channeling the powers of the edifice, Compassion 5 once showed the Eighth Doctor a vision of the event. Frightful images of an enemy first strike on Gallifrey, boiling away the 3 oceans and levelling the great mountain ranges in the northern hemisphere until the planet burned and roiled and became a cinder. The Rivera manuscript detailed the Doctor's praxis-induced vision of the enemy's first attack on Gallifrey further. The enemy first attacked Gallifrey's new sphere, telepathically corrupting many Time Lords and overwhelming them with seizures and madness. The chapter houses of Gallifrey were then destroyed by black fireballs that materialized out of the sky, described as supercharged chunks of the causal nexus itself. At this time, a number of stolen TARDISes returned to Gallifrey, detonating on materialization. Enemy soldiers resembling Ashla shock troops, post-human cyborgs, materialized out of gouges in the sky, besieging the groups of survivors in their loom sheds for days, before plunging into the machinery of the breeding engines, detonating and leaving the looms intact, but mutated. Finally, the enemy neutralized the Eye of Harmony, and the entire planet vanished into cataclysm. In the Doctor's vision, the surviving Time Lords decided to break their non-interference policy and retaliate by going back in time and razing the enemy battle worlds before the attack on Gallifrey occurred, preventing the event. The enemy erased this counterattack from history by detonating a Starkiller in the systems where the Gallifreyans had obtained the materials used to construct their fleet at a point before the materials had been mined. These strikes and counterstrikes continued and quickly spread into a full-blown war. Far into the war, at a time when the Time Lords were losing, details of the event and several other aspects of the start of the war were kept from the Gallifreyan public. On account of the mutation of the looms and use of black fire, this devastation of Gallifrey may have been the origin of the Kingdom of Beasts, an alter-time realm containing the devastated ruins of the Citadel following the War in Heaven. The kingdom was watched over by its corrupted Eye of Harmony, the Great Black Eye, and populated by the Malak, whom many speculated were mutated versions of the Time Lords. As several decades prior, the War King had prepared Gallifrey for the conflict, when it began it was not in a surprise attack by the enemy, but in a battle on Dronid, which they were prepared for. There was an attack on Gallifrey in the early days of the war, but it was nothing like the attack described in the Rivera manuscript. At a time far in the future of the war, Mathara's faction Paradox war fleet decided to travel back in history to Romana III's Gallifrey shortly before the first enemy attack. They planned to take over Gallifrey, prepare for the event, and launch their own war against the enemy. The Eighth Doctor decided to use the powers of the edifice to obliterate Gallifrey before the enemy could, destroying the faction and killing almost all of the Time Lords. Compassion 5, believing incorrectly that the enemy were ancestor cells, believed that the destruction of the Time Lords at this time also prevented the enemy from maturing into a threat to the universe. However, she would go on to fight the enemy many times later in her life. And so ends the account that the war ended before it began at the hands of the Eighth Doctor, essentially erasing itself despite powers from the future war meeting the Doctor earlier in his life. In many ways, the events that are coming up did happen, but were erased by the Eighth Doctor or weren't, and instead lived on in another reality. All of this will be discussed at the end of the series in a separate entry on theories of the war and the identity of the enemy. After the fall of the Renegade Presidency, Dronid was littered with leftover time technology. As a result, it became the centre of the Spiral Underworld, with criminal organisations from across the lesser species flocking there to gather time technology. This became the first front of the enemy, who not only began gaining power, but also spread its deep-rooted philosophy. Not only did it gather support from other criminal organisations, the groups that tried to subdue its rising power did so by learning its methods, and so inadvertently spread its philosophy. Upon realizing this, the Time Lords tried and failed to retro-alter Dronid's timeline, but discovered it had been protected by the enemy. Instead, they tried to build their own power base on Dronid by planting an agent there to counter the enemy infiltration by subverting and controlling faction Paradox's presence on the planet. However, this agent went native, and so they gained little ground. With it now obvious the battle would need to be fought on the ground, the Time Lords and their enemy began to aggressively ally themselves with other off-world groups. The enemy supplied its affiliates with greater and greater levels of time technology, but the Time Lords responded by co-opting larger and larger military units, including the Gabrielidine military. The first Type 90 TARDISes probed the perimeter of Dronid's noosphere days before the first battle began. 2 days before the Cataclysm, the Doctor attempted to make peace on Dronid, claiming that he had an old connection with one of the enemy's agents there. However, his acquaintance betrayed him, and he was thought to have died as the battle began. The Time Lord allies began the first battle by moving their warships into position around Dronid and bombarding the enemy power bases there. The enemy had prepared for this, but the bombardment activated the world processor engines that House Devora had installed in the planet's foundation after disposing of the Renegade Presidency. Locals were forced to take shelter in bunkers as a poisonous sky blew lethal, all-consuming clouds of spores throughout the streets. Compassion 5 may have been involved in the battle. Even 50 years after the Cataclysm, Dronid was still suffering the effects. Cults and criminal groups were the only government left. The faction Paradox mission in Smithsman's Town owned one of the few automobiles to survive, but its bodywork had been eaten away by the Time Lord's clockwork bacteria. The Doctor's corpse, taking on the moniker of the Relic, was planted in the ruins of Dronid to make it appear that he had died during the battle. The Crotons managed to intercept a Time Lord relaying information from Dronid to the High Council. In their interrogation of him, they learned of the war and decided to try and gain technology from it to aid in their own war against the Metatraxi. Riots occurred on one Gallifrey at the start of the war, as civil unrest reached a breaking point. Shortly after the fighting began on Dronid, the fighting moved on to the Thousand-Year Battles, fought on Utter Lost, Kaiwa and Moandasa. Then the enemy attempted a direct attack on Gallifrey, which caught the Time Lords by surprise, and destroyed many technologies, including the Sash of Rassilon, the DMAT gun, and the Hand of Omega. However, thanks to the War King's preparations, the prophecies of Gallifrey's destruction were avoided. The war quickly became a four-dimensional series of strikes and counterstrikes, which Mr. Quixote described as a temporal stalemate. In the second year of the war, the faction took advantage of the confusion caused by it, and sent its remote shock troops to attack planets significant to the Time Lords, including Simia-KK-98. They hoped that Gallifrey wouldn't see any connection between them and the remote, but the Time Lords easily deduced that they were behind the attacks. In the initial phase of the conflict, planets such as Nebo were used as staging posts for Gallifreyan forces. Time engines were embedded into these planets to create pockets of reality outside normal space-time. The armies of the Time Lords, the enemy and faction Paradox, fought great battles across the surface of Mercy, killing the 150 human colonists already living there. This came to an end when one of the powers changed history so that, 20 generations before the fighting, the Arbiterum bombed the planet with blacklight warheads, rendering it an inhospitable wasteland. Goral Shai of the First Wave was involved in many early battles of the war. The Ganda Nema campaigns, in which Godfather Shuk was captured, the rout of Wraithadween cultists, the Lamas 4 campaign, and the Spike, a conflict against the enemy over the Vault of Heaven. Soldiers of the Time Lords also fought a campaign on Aluthoa. In the 4th year of the war, the Time Lords began experiments in biological technologies, creating regen inf. They also became aware of the Remonstration Bureau. Enabled with Celestis technology, the enemy began using Anarchitects as weapons early in the war, viruses that could change atoms. In the 5th year of the war, the major powers of the war attempted to negotiate peace in the Venue Accords. The Accords lasted 1 picosecond and concluded that peace was an impossibility. The Book of the War summarized them as an agreement to disagree. In response to the failure of the Accords, the second wave of Gallifreyan military forces was created. On the Infernal Sphere, Baphomet obtained information on Thaumaktopus Memeticus's origins, leading him to be murdered by a T. Memeticus in the form of Thelema. The Daemons faced a private Gotterdammerung, with many of them dying in a gigantic battle mode. The faction unearthed a Daemon skeleton from Deimos and converted it into a warship. In the 6th year of the war, Devonire attempted to make peace between the Time Lords and faction Paradox by finding Grandfather Paradox's missing arm. After a deal with the Maculata Formosion Kaiwa resulted in Devonire acquiring his own severed arm from the future, he was stricken with a severe case of paradox anxiety and imprisoned. Later in the 6th year of the war, the Second Wave underwent a successful campaign of sterilization against all of the planets where the faction had begun propagating the remote. The first planet sterilized was Ordifica in 2596. Mathara led an evacuation on the planet in the Justinian. Fitzkriner and Laura Tobin were among those on board. Mathara deposited the evacuees on the Time Lord superweapon Anathema in 1799, which was en route to destroy Earth in 1997. As the faction was busy retreating from the Second Wave, a pre-war era Babel hid within Isaac Newton's timeline and attempted to rewrite human history into a weapon against the enemy. Detecting that post-human civilization could be replaced with a constant sacrifice of fresh bodies and fresh blood in service of Gallifrey, the pilots' coterie used Praxis to send 3 pilots, including Erasmus, to the 17th century to recruit Nate Silver as an instrument to prevent the Babel's interference. A small faction mission led by Mother Sphinx became involved to ensure that the Gregorian Compact wasn't written out of history. They recruited Greenaway to spy on Silver. Larissa followed the Babel, and after an encounter with the faction hid within Afra Bren's timelines, the involved parties all gathered at Salaman's house in 1671, where the Babel escaped unharmed due to Larissa mistaking Silver to be the Babel's host. A second confrontation occurred in 1682, when the Babel attempted to install Silver as an immortal puppet leading the Service, a secret service within the British Empire of spies and cultists. Larissa stabbed Newton with her continuity needle, forcing out the Babel so it could be defeated by Erasmus. Silver stopped the needle from erasing Newton from history, and the faction conducted rituals to heal time. Circa the 6th year of the war, 46 years before the major breakout on Sharda, the Blood coteries illegally manipulated the biodata of Demetra Kine and 4 shadow weapon-proof warriors, resulting in all 5 being imprisoned by the Time Lords. This was so they could get revenge against Shungkaka when Sharda inevitably had a breakout. Sometime early in the war era, House Sarpexia conducted the Jungle Children experiment to see how Time Lord biodata would be changed by being raised by humans. Kaspar Hauser was placed in Nuremberg in 1828, but though Germany's timeline began to reshape around him, he was relatively unchanged. Shortly after Entaro Dara was brought into the project, the phenomena of temporarily displaced Hauser Kinder, or Hauser children, became increasingly common during the war. In the 8th year of the war, the breakaway 13-day republic was founded by Anastasia Romanov, but quickly lost in the Battle of Valentine's Day. On anathema, Mathara took Fitz Kreiner back with her to the 11th Day Empire, though he left behind a remembered version of himself. Kreiner quickly rose to the rank of father before being put in charge of one of the last remote colonies, shortly before it was cut off from the Empire. House Devora attempted to alter Earth's history by inspiring 16th century philosopher Giordano Bruno to become pope and lead Europe into an early age of rationalism and science. Father Self subverted all of Devora's efforts and integrated Bruno into the remote of Anathema. After several generations had passed on Anathema, it arrived near Earth in 1997. The Eighth Doctor, Sam Jones and Sarah Jane Smith, became involved with it and stopped it from fulfilling its purpose. The Doctor then took on Code and Compassion as companions, remembrances of Fitz and Tobin. While most of the remotes stayed on Anathema, some migrated to Earth, forming a small cult in 21st century California. A war veteran found asylum in the 11th Day Empire for a while, but they were eventually evicted as part of a faction paradox initiation competition led by Starch. Seol, formerly Kelsey Hooper, won said competition and became a cousin. Despite being involved in a cultural exchange with Theo Possible, Seol quickly tired of the faction and smuggled her biodata and consciousness into a new body, leaving her original to sign up for a faction mission to Moondasa and be wiped from history. Seol managed to evade the faction in her new body for a considerable period of time. In the 10th year of the war, Compassion met with the War King to form an alliance that entailed opening a second front against the enemy. Carmen Gay was present for this meeting, which she novelized in Fantastical Travels in an Infinite Universe. In the 11th year of the war, the third wave of Gallifreyan military was created. The last campaign of the second wave saw the usage of the last 3 remaining Babels against enemy forces on the planet Leth. The campaign ended when an unknown assassin, potentially a renegade Time Lord such as the Doctor or the Master, euthanized the Babel's lobotomized operators, and the Babels were torn apart on the battlefield. The Time Lords left the planet ravaged by time fracture. The 5th Doctor and Nyssa visited Leth and found a powerful Viridium staff there. In the 14th year of the war, the faction's 11-Day Empire was breached by the analytical engine of the Star Chamber, an English court within the Houses of Parliament associated with the service, and severely damaged the faction underground while it rebuilt the Empire and re-evaluated itself. As the war progressed, the Time Lords began severely altering their biology to combat the enemy, some becoming what both Justine McManus and the Eighth Doctor described as monsters. While they had been experimenting with non-humanoid soldiers with the third wave, it was only in the 17th year of the war that they began splicing their people with biodata from the lesser species, creating the fourth wave. The Time Lords accepted many renegades back into their society to further war efforts. The Rani and Barusa became tutors to newly loomed soldiers. As part of their hatchling projects, the High Council created clones of several renegades, including the Master and the Rani. In a period spanning between the 22nd and 28th centuries, Father Kreiner roamed the universe hunting for renegade Time Lords and collecting their severed heads. Influenced by the Celestis and weary of the changes going through Gallifreyan society, Goral Shai put into motion a complicated plan to destroy the universe. He assembled a quincunx out of Primo de Valega, Todd Calavero, Gadara, Emiusha, and Momakani, all made out from the loom of House Madoran, but scattered apart in history so as to not alert the Time Lords. He used a meme core, faction alter-time technology, to place House Madoran in the Netherweald, its connection to the Caldera temporarily rewriting the laws of the universe along Mexica beliefs. The Immaculata tried to disrupt these plans but was killed. By Goral Shai's design, the quincunx gathered at Huixacatpetel in 1506 to be forced into the new fire ceremony. Goral Shai was at the centre of the ceremony, pulling out Momakani's heart to become a living embodiment of Zuitekutli. Goral Shai was unable to use his newfound godhood to destroy reality, confined by the purpose of the ceremony. All he could do was sacrifice himself to cause the cyclical renewal of the universe. In the 18th year of the war, Mantissa led the Time Beast Assault, a failed invasion of the City of the Saved involving the assistance of the city's mayor, Verifant. Robert Scarrat quickly became a notable member of the Fourth Wave. His earliest victory was preventing an uprising at a post-human world, which provided House Jean Thelips with praxis. At another early point in his military career, he met the enemy in open parley and utter lost. In the 20th century of the war, the Eighth Retro War occurred. Scarrat was sent to Delphi in 279 BCE to make a sacrifice that strengthened the Eighth Earth Front. The timeline of the Eighth Retro War was later manipulated by one. Sergeant Instructor Littlejohn once gave a speech to a young batch of Fourth Wave soldiers, telling them that tardigrades were connected to the enemy. In the 24th year of the war, Gendricenses gave a speech on the Grandfather's Maw, a gulf in reality connecting the far future to the deep past. In the 25th year of the war, the Fifth Wave was created. The Gauntlet, a Time Lord training facility, was also founded around this time. Hiding from the gods of Dela, a Time Lord house led an invasion of the version of 1970s Earth in the Sphinx's Bottle universe. Chris Quedge, a brainwashed former companion of the Seventh Doctor, helped in securing the Earth and dealing with the horror. Christine Summerfield was the only native of the Earth to escape, journeying through the empty ruins of Gallifrey abandoned by the House who invaded her world, only to eventually be found and recruited by Faction Paradox. Quedge was exposed to fatal levels of radiation in the final stage of the Bottle Universe invasion. His masters were initially fine with leaving him to die, but Irving Braxiatel heard about the situation and requested they save Quedge. With the help of a Time Lord monk, Quedge regenerated into a new body which was remotely shaped by Time Lord military strategists to be resistant to the Fat, a talent-feeding parasite. The first thing he did in his new body was a mission to Paracletes in 2596 to recover data from Edward Watkinson's expedition to the planet. In the 29th century of the war, while Quedge was recovering from his regeneration at the Gauntlet, the Time Lords decided to use him in their Army of One project without his knowledge. The Quedgen were created from Chris's timeline. In his new body, he returned to 2596 to help defeat a Delan god which merged with Absalom Sleed. On the 30th anniversary of the war, Entaradora gave the monster's coda to the Fifth Wave, a military address. What do we fear? After 30 years of war, we fear that it was lost in the first nanosecond. We fear that we are fighting something unstoppable and ancient. We fear that we may become what we fight, or that we already have done so. Thanks to Xenoprediction, we now fear that either our predictability or unpredictability will destroy us. These fears are continually reinforced by the secrecy surrounding the leadership of the enemy, and it's possible that from the point of view of our ruling elite, this is exactly what the secrecy is for. If we believed the true enemy was this, or that the species of time-active upstarts, or that rogue house, we'd simply shrug and go back to sleep, and let the enemy forces roll over us as we dozed. Instead, we have made monsters, because only fear will make us fight. Fearing that reality would be reformed by the Ferretu, who escaped their dying universe and became all high gods, Quedge's masters in the Bottle universe allied with the people of the World Sphere. Quedge partnered with Clarence, then met with Irving Braxiatel, Bernie Summerfield, and Jason Kane at KS-159 in 2596. On Dela, fighting broke out among the gods, and Teke, a god favoured by the Celestis Smoked Mirror, rose to dominance. Teke betrayed the other Ferretu by either killing them or keeping them trapped in the dying universe. Quedge, Clarence, Summerfield, and Kane went to Dela, banished Teke back to the Ferretu's universe, and prevented the rest of the Ferretu from evacuating. In the process, Quedge was physically regressed back to his original body, albeit at the age of 13. Even after the Ferretu danger was over, Quedge's masters remained in the Bottle universe, and the people stayed locked in their world sphere. In the 31st year of the war, Quedge, now in a mature version of his original body, went on a mission to 1999 Los Angeles to intervene with the activities of Faction Hollywood. Quedge faced off against Michael Brookhaven at the shooting of Mujun, the Ghost Kingdom, which was filmed with a Celestis meme mine. After Quedge duelled with Brookhaven at the climax of the film, the enemy manifested as an Ainu god and caused Brookhaven's apparent demise. Before leaving, the god said, "All the six need recostuming, and then the story can begin and end as scripted." The plot of Mujun, the Ghost Kingdom, greatly resembled the future destruction of the 11th Day Empire, which occurred around 20 war-era years later, with its 6 main characters being very similar to 6 key individuals involved in the Empire's fall. As the war progressed through its fourth decade, direct combat began being dropped by the Time Lords for more psychological tactics, based on principles of subversion and cultural impregnation. By the 32nd year of the war, the 8-day week had occurred, and battles had been fought on Pentralaxia and Cuchulain's Rift. In this year, the Fourth Wave fought an ideological crusade against the remote of Valhalla, using the Jalama Reed and New Young Gods transmissions, creating the Broken Remote. Also in the 32nd year, 3 House Arpixia TARDISes were destroyed while investigating the Grandfather's Maw. Gendricenses, Mincosa, and Philites were sent to investigate the disaster. In one iteration of history, the severed head of Robert Scarrat from a future point in the war was discovered at the Maw. To prevent the future timeline seen in the memories of the future Scarrat, the Time Lords imprisoned him until after the time when he would have lost his head. Having acquired KS-159 during the All-High God Crisis, Irving Braxiatel founded the Braxiatel Collection. Based in the 2600s, Brax began severely manipulating local history with the end goal of building a new homeworld for his people, a house that had retreated into a bottle universe to escape the Ferritu. The wartime Time Lords were aware of his actions. When Bernie Summerfield asked Straxus if his people had any plans to stop Brax, he said, "I'm afraid I can't comment. If something needs to be done, it will be done." X-12 was assigned to a posting in 1880s Germany, a crucial war nexus. He was captured by an enemy representative and exposed to a short children's story by Wilhelm Liebknecht about an ambitious king becoming a puppet to a legion of spiders, a metaphor for the Time Lords being overthrown from within by the enemy. X-12 was rescued from this time by a regen Inth. In the 35th year of the war, Robert Scarrat gave a speech to the Fifth Wave trainees at the Gauntlet. Around this time, Scarrat conducted a series of apportation exercises on pre-time-aware Earth, including one with Elizabeth Canning in 1753. Predicting that Tagonique would become the hub of an advanced galactic empire allied with the enemy, House Arpexia sent 3 artificial agents, Defresis, Anhedra, and Jarx, to interfere with the technological development of Tagoniki. The agents manipulated Mesquividius into building a device which killed the planet's prime minister and brought genuine magic to Tagonique. Mired in superstition and magic, the Tagoniki never allied with the enemy, and were erased from existence several decades later due to the universe imposing rationality onto them. In the 38th year of the war, the Seventh Wave was created. After the Seventh Retro War, the war entered a period of entrenchment. A number of events involving Sherlock Holmes occurred in the war, all at least before the conflict's 48th year. Not too long before the 41st year, the Celestis provided 21st century scientific genius, Jimmy Moriarty, with a method of ritualistic time travel, which he tested by sending Gillian Petra and Thomas Corkle to 1882. Both participants were interested in Sherlock Holmes. Petra became a maid at 221B Baker Street to discreetly study the detective for her criminology thesis, which Corkle, on instructions from Moriarty, tried to experiment with history by preventing Holmes from becoming successful. Petra entered a romantic relationship with Holmes, accidentally changing history herself. After learning of Corkle's plan, Petra prevented him from severely damaging Holmes's timeline. She then returned to her home era by harnessing the power of Krakatoa's eruption. Gillian was recruited by the Celestis to be an investigator. She briefly returned to Sherlock Holmes in 1890 to return a pair of shoes she had taken during her previous visit. Due to a time ring malfunction, Straxus became stranded in 1888 Ceylon with a Quedge named Septimus. They became involved with Ludwig Corre, manipulating him to create the God Machine partially using one of Straxus's combat chips. After completing the God Machine, Corre vanished and his consciousness was stored in the chip. Sherlock Holmes and John Watson thought he was murdered by Straxus, but were unable to find sufficient evidence. Straxus and Septimus continued to live on Victorian Earth. In an effort to catch the attention of the Time Lords, they founded Straxus Imperial, an auction company which they used to circulate artifacts not supposed to have been discovered until later points in history. In 1893, while Sherlock was pretending to be dead, an emergency setting of Straxus's time ring overrode Bernie Summerfield's time ring and brought her to London, where she found refuge with Mycroft Holmes. With Mycroft exposed to a time traveller, Septimus committed a series of murders all relating to the number 7, in the hopes that it would cause Mycroft to think so intensely about the concept of 7 as to summon the 7th Doctor through quantum mnemonics. When Bernice and Mycroft confronted Straxus at an earlier point in his timeline, the older Straxus was imprisoned for changing history, and Septimus was taken for dissection. The younger Straxus then briefly met with Bernice in the time vortex. Circa the mid-1910s, Sherlock investigated the Book of the Enemy, and was erased from history by it, his entire life becoming fiction written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Wartime individuals would go on to think of Holmes as a purely fictional character, but scant evidence of his original existence survived. Also around this time, the Enemy fictionalized Ruritania, a gentleman's club, and the Martians and their invasion of Earth. Around its 40th year, the war entered a phase of entrenchment. Faction Paradox returned to being a major power in the war, albeit a far subtler one than they were before. The Remote were completely independent of Faction Paradox by this time. The faction was recruiting new members from planets as varied as Salatopus and Lerma. Piloting her ship to Earth in the mid-3rd millennium BCE, Triffis used the Chromasticon with Tefn to play with the planet's history, and make dozens of alternative timelines where Earth was ruled by different types of aliens, including mermaids, mutant pigeons, intelligent cosmic rays, gods from parallel dimensions, gorgons, shades, Kyalites, Galaxians, Medusae, Krakani, Vikings, and the Nova. The final timeline to be created was one where the wartime manipulation of Native American tribes resulted in Yellowbird using faction techniques to summon an army of ghost warriors at Wounded Knee in 1890, beginning a new era of North America being taken back by its indigenous peoples. The changes in history were noticed by the War King and Enigma Tree, along with some time-sensitives and many former companions of the Doctor. An angelic being unwound time so that Triffis never obtained her ship, and none of the history-warping events surrounding the Chromasticon happened. Cousins Berthold and Ernest joined the nautical expedition of Sir George Dymchurch in 1810, in order to pervert history by delaying the formulation of the theory of evolution by decades, negatively affecting the Time Lords. They created living pterodactyls for Dymchurch to discover on New Guinea and bring back to Europe. But Dymchurch overheard them discussing their plans on the return voyage, and destroyed all evidence of the pterodactyls on the ship. In the 44th year of the war, the 8th wave was created. At the edges of the war, the Hussar, a renegade Time Lord, was permitted to travel through inconsequential areas of history. The Hussar got caught in the schemes of Father Christomus, and was killed at Serendipity Keep in order to create a Loa. His TARDIS, the Kraken, joined Christomas's Bankside division of the faction, which with the newborn Loa went independent from the rest of the 11-Day Empire. At the behest of Godfather Stendek, cousins Mace and Braquemard came to the presidency's head to psychrometrically examine 8 artifacts: the thermal projector used by Cotdell during an enemy encounter on Cretaceous Earth, George Stillsom's hat, Philemon Smallcoat's glasses, the DVD case of the Collection of Necessary Secrets copy of Monsters of the Deep, the wooden bell used by Thelema during the enemy incursion at the Infernal Sphere, a burnt mangrove twig from the enemy's attack on the Green World, Bobby's cell phone, and the Venusian translator used by Heloise d'Argenteuil. Through this they learned of Thomoctopus mimeticus, an aspect of the enemy. Their understanding allowed a mimeticus to manifest, taking over Mace's body and killing Braquemard. Thus, the enemy had full access to the stacks, and the faction technically had their first enemy specimen. Turner, Martain, and Zeller of Faction Paradox worked together to put Hitchbot in 2010's Philadelphia as a lure for the Compound, an aspect of the enemy. 6 of the Compound went on a mission to decapitate Hitchbot, to allow the disorderly incorrect timeline to proceed. All but 1 were captured by Turner and Martain. The survivor, alone and confused, returned to the Compound lair in a hidden sector of space-time at 1 Liberty Place, revealing the lair's location to the faction. Some of the data gained by the faction was given to the Time Lords, and the sacred Compound creatures were given to Godfather Stendek. The faction were involved in an incident with Iris Wildtime and the Shopkeeper. When the wartime powers began using weapons which put the spirits of history in danger, the faction sent cousin Andreas to Tonton Macout's prison in Cyclone Tracy to find a solution, a cure-all for time. After gathering the necessary ingredients, 2 Type 103 TARDISes, Demi and Media, the reflection of an enemy agent, the ground bones of Time Lord soldiers, and the shadow weapon of a faction soldier, Mankut made the cure-all which attracted Loa. However, the cure-all was nothing but bait, and Makut consumed the Loa to attain their godlike aspects. Before leaving Andreas, Makut explained that, in a way, he would be fixing the faction's problem, as according to him, there's only one way to significantly change an ecosystem: introduce a predator. However, despite having the powers of a god, Makut somehow died. Cousins Jezebella, Darius, and Fen visited the post-apocalyptic ruins of Kent after it was ravaged by a battle of the war involving the army of the Seventh Son of the Seventh Son. They encountered Vermis Superior, collecting bodies for young Vermis Superior to feed on. Jezebella and Darius were killed and added to the food pile. Fen then witnessed the were-crows feeding on the adult Vermis Superior and becoming the final aspect of the enemy. On 14th of April 1643, two armies of Hornheads and Canticleers declared the Hain Valley to be a battlefield of the war in heaven, and they began to clear the newly formed town of Samhain. Despite the imposition of a time lock on the area, the shopkeeper and Iris Wildtime were able to help the newly elected mayor, Michael Drake, defeat the armies by swallowing them whole. After letting the war pour into him, Drake became quite a difficult man. After his death, he was commemorated with a monument at the Samhain Elder Church, with read, "In memory of Michael Drake, who kept the war from Samhain." Either by chance or enemy design, Quedge Ursa, piloting a Type 70 TARDIS, crashed on the wasteland of Ursa in an empty far-future era. The damage to his TARDIS interacted with the unique nature of Chris Quedge's timeline to create a crude version of Quedgean creation, with every attempted dematerialization rendering the fabric of time to create three basic Quedgean. Stranded on this planet for an unimaginable length, the original Quedge eventually resorted to founding a society of Quedgean dependent on cannibalism. This society would only encounter the outside world after the war ended. In the 46th year of the war, a group of 13 renegade Time Lords tried to escape it by using time rings to journey into a cluster of parallel universes where the Roman Empire never fell. The renegades created links between the universes, allowing them to unite into the Empire of Empires. House Miraflex sent a Quedge to contain the situation. He united all the universes where the Nazis won the Second World War into the Greater German Reich, created by the Time Lords years earlier as the Second Time Front, and convinced them to go to war with the Romans. This created the known worlds, with a divide between the Empire of Empires and the Greater German Reich. After several decades of warfare, the Romans, led by Marcus Americanus Scriptor, were victorious over the Germans. In the end, a member of House Miraflex came in and reinstated the boundaries between worlds. House Linear Crux would later claim credit for the Roman victory. The Second World War was the last stand of the Star Chamber, but the Churchill Index discussing their involvement was lost. The Book of the War mentioned an entry about the Index in its discussion of the enemy, but was apparently retro-erased from the book by a violent unknown event, alongside entries about Miss Hiroshima and the gods of the Ainu. After an encounter in her youth with the Malak or Lena, Imogen Chantry became interested in spreading the Catholic faith to groups like the Malak and the Remote. However, after becoming Pope, she began the Beatrician Crusade against the Malak, and in the encyclical De Umbris Siderum, she advocated the brainwashing of Remote into Catholic shock troopers. The frontier in time was the edge of the Time Lord's new sphere, beyond which lay worlds, people, and events which Gallifrey did not or could not understand. Several so-called frontier worlds were situated on the frontier. Orichol was one planet which lay on the boundary between the new spheres. It was located in the Amazolian system, where Avis had encountered the enemy in a Praxis vision before the war. The grinding of the rival new spheres on Orichol provided a volcano, which spewed the Praxis-range nootropic drug Cyberon. When consumed in large doses, the Cyberon fluid would connect its host to a hive mind, which sought to liberate individuals and species by converting their bodies to run on Cyberon fluid. These converted Cyberons waged a lengthy war of conquest against the Earth Alliance until the 31st century. Orichol and its residents, including the Cyberon King, were destroyed in 2989. Until 2992, the Cyberons were instead led by Dracula, who according to a separate account had been resurrected by Lilith to lead the enemy. Another frontier world was the Uptime Gate to the City of the Saved. In the war's 48th year, a civil war began on the City of the Saved. It lasted for 10 years and ended in the city's destruction. While planning to restore his people to the planet Maximadirus, Irving Braxiatel became aware of the Daendom, a future species who would learn the secret of time travel and could rival the Time Lords. He tried to prevent their creation by severely manipulating the timeline of Bernie Summerfield, who seemed to be accidentally instrumental in their creation. However, these efforts only made the Daendom more aggressive and paranoid, and they travelled back and began an invasion of the galaxy to protect their own history and ensure their creation. Brax led a galaxy-wide resistance against the Daendom, but they nonetheless conquered the universe and wiped out the human race. However, Bernice and Brax engineered a war between the future and past Daendom, causing them to destroy themselves before they developed time travel. Though in the process Brax was shot dead by a Daendom soldier, the scheme reduced the Daendom to a small group of skirmishers without much will to fight. After the Battle of Pakar Shipyards, the war was considered won. Some destroyed planets came back without any knowledge of their destruction, and the Braxiatel collection vanished without a trace. In 2057, the Daleks began their invasion of Earth. They first attacked London, herding local politicians into Parliament Square to be exterminated. As they wiped out scattered cities as a demonstration of their superiority, Earth society collapsed overnight. Izzy Ring and her brother, PJ, lived in a Dalek work camp in California. The invasion ended nearly years after it began, when a TARDIS exploded in an event called the Source. Though the explosion destroyed the Daleks, it also fragmented the TARDIS's inhabitants throughout time, and temporal shrapnel created saints throughout the world. Time-sensitive revelators named these saints and gave them stories, which were spread by the humanist church through films, each viewing imbuing audience belief into a new interpretation of the saint. Homogeny and Hegemony, seeking to regain their permeance and join the 11-Day Empire, recruited these possibilities, but none of them could manage time in a way that was needed. So Hegemony and Homogeny tried convincing Izzy Ring to kill Caroline and create a paradox that would please their superiors. However, PJ stopped Izzy by sacrificing himself to become a saint. Their plan, defeated, Homogeny and Hegemony themselves became saints in Trafalgar Square. The War in Heaven began severely intersecting with Earth's timeline in 1999, when the nightly rocket attacks began erasing things from history. By 2001, Faction Paradox had become a fashionable countercultural household name. The night before the Ghost Point, various agendas came to a head in a town from beneath which a war TARDIS was attempting to rise. Tiffany Courter, a pop star manipulated by the executive, who claimed to be the real Faction Paradox, went on a journey of self-discovery and turned against her masters, who triggered the Tiffany Courter event in retaliation while Tiffany bonded with the TARDIS to become its pilot. The ship's rise was also facilitated by a ritual enacted by the would-be occultist Inangela Marrero, with help from her life partner Horror. However, Valentine Bremen, a paranoid paramedic with a deeper understanding of the war than most, was manipulated by the grandfather cults, also claiming to be the real Faction Paradox, into using a red uranium atomic bomb and planting it within the TARDIS. Although Inangela talked him out of using it at the last minute, the bomb detonated anyway due to the magnetic pulse sent out by the TARDIS as it activated itself, preventing the manifestation and seemingly creating, or at any rate strengthening, the Ghost Point, leeching meaning from human culture. By a later account, the rise of the TARDIS had constituted an attempt by the Universal Machine to rise. It didn't get another chance to do so for over 300 billion years. Over the war's fifth decade, the conflict reached full entrenchment. In her lecture, The Cultural Impact of Wartime, Intaradora noted that more Gallifreys had been lost than might be thought prudent. After another was lost in the Battle of Mutter's Cluster, the remaining Gallifreys, previously self-segregated, banded together and became numbered. Gallifrey 8 was covered in loom stacks and chronoforgers, which provided fodder for the war. Gallifrey 9 was used to store temporal weapons such as DMAT guns, and Gallifrey 12 was used to train soldiers, including Homunculette. Around the 50th year of the war, House Linear Crook secretly organised a voyage into the Grandfather's Maw to retrieve Leviathan biodata for research, and Taradora was chosen to captain the San Greal. She betrayed Linear Crooks after going into the Maw by abandoning the mission, and trying to instead found a new universe free of the war. Linear Crooks recruited Robert Scarrat to captain the Breakspear into the Maw, punish Entaradora, and finish her mission. Compassion witnessed a potential future where Scarrat's voyage was successful, and the biodata research led to the Time Lords harnessing the power of the Maw to obliterate Earth from history, so she contacted Scarrat before he got on the Breakspear and showed him the consequences of success. The Breakspear was infiltrated by agents of the Celestis, the Enemy, Faction Paradox, and Entaradora. The Breakspear's voyage ended in a disastrous meeting with the Sangreal. A TARDIS containing the severed head of Scarrat escaped and gravitated back towards the edges of the Maw, where it was found by the Time Lords in the 32nd year of the war, who learned of the entire debacle through the head's memories and prevented it from happening. Around the same time, Sabbath was appointed Godfather of Faction Paradox's military wing. He and Godfather Morlock went to 1899 England to kill Fiora Venn as part of a ritual and encountered Justine McManus. Morlock decided to let Justine join the faction, and she was sent to Dronid to learn under Sanjira. During Justine's stay, Celestis agents in the corporation manipulated Sanjira into discovering the relic, and he decided to respectfully send it into the time vortex, unaware of its true significance. It travelled to Earth, where the United States of America found it and put it in the toy store, their repository for alien technology. Following the 2150s Dalek invasion of Earth, it was moved to the Black Man's store within the 2169 House of Commons ruins. He sold it to Quixote, who set up an auction for it in the unthinkable city on Earth in 2069, a ginormous ziggurat built with block transfer computation. In the 50th year of the war, Justine was summoned from Dronid back to the 11-Day Empire and sent with cousin Manuel to represent the faction at Quixote's auction. Also invited were Unisic, who sent Lieutenant Kathleen Bregman and Colonel Joseph Armitage Cortez, the Enemy, who sent the Shift, the Celestis, who sent Trask, and the Time Lords, who sent Homunculette and his Type 103 TARDIS, Marie, from several centuries in the future of the war. Quixote also invited the Daleks, but the Crotons overpowered their representatives and took their place. The final uninvited participants at the auction were the 8th Doctor and Sam Jones, who to Homunculette's horror was severely breaking the laws of time by attending. Though the Celestis almost obtained the relic, the Doctor tricked them into trading it to him in return for the Shift, who the Doctor had trapped in his mind. The Doctor took the relic to Koeskia and destroyed it with a thermostryson bomb. Having failed her mission through no fault of her own, Cousin Justine returned to the 11-Day Empire. In the Houses of Parliament within the Empire, the faction elders decided to try create a sentient new homeworld for the faction by sending a warship to the moment when I.M. Foreman became the biosphere of the planet Dust in the 30th century, by infecting him with a biodata virus developed by Godfather Morlock a few years prior. However, the faction didn't account for the Third Doctor and Sarah Jane Smith coming to Dust. Instead of infecting Foreman, the virus was attracted to the Doctor after he was shot by Magdalena Bishop. The Doctor regenerated, and the virus took hold in his body. As a result, the Doctor never stopped the Eight Legs from conquering the universe. With history changing because of this, the timelines became much more uncertain and malleable. Some regions of space-time degenerated into a series of realities which formed the Obverse. The Celestis later constructed the Enclave, a pocket galaxy full of different races and cultures that separated the Obverse from the universe. A cataclysmic war began between the inhabitants of the main universe and the inhabitants of the Enclave. The Eighth Doctor, Compassion, and Fitzkriner briefly became involved with the beginning of this conflict, but they were pushed away by Iris Wildtime. Participants in the ensuing war included the Galactic Federation, Daleks, the Glassmen of Valencia, Cybermen, Stygertrudes, Draconians, Gilligasts, Sontarans, Sambicarts, Ice Warriors, and according to many sources, several incarnations of the Doctor from the Eighth Doctor's future. Mere Cock refugees from the Enclave conflict attempted to settle on Earth in 1973, where they encountered the Third Doctor before his altered death, along with Iris Wildtime, Joe Grant, and Thomas Daly. Iris would claim to be from the Obverse itself when not claiming to be a Gallifreyan. Outside of the war, the Obverse interacted with the outside universe during many of Iris's adventures. The pre-war era Time Lords of a clone world Gallifrey led by Romana II became aware of the war through monitoring the Obverse and the conflict in the Enclave. Romana regenerated into a body more suitable for warfare and declared herself the War Queen and mistress of the 9 Gallifreys. In preparation for Gallifrey's darkest hour, she began stockpiling weapons in the Slaughterhouse, a secret arsenal protected by a time eddy, and she cleared whole sections of the planet to start building battle TARDISes. She planned to use bull TARDISes to mate with Compassion to create a new Type 103 TARDIS. Romana dispatched two of her most trusted agents, Gandar and Cavis, to capture Compassion while she transformed into a Type 103 TARDIS in Avalon. While the agents managed to almost start a nuclear war between humans and Avalonians, they did not capture Compassion, who escaped with the 8th Doctor and Fitzkriner. After the Doctor installed a randomizer in her, Compassion managed to elude the Time Lords for a considerable time, but she was eventually found by an operative in the 19th century, Cuthbert Simpson. Compassion and her two companions were forced to go to Romana's Gallifrey, where they came in contact with forces from a later point in the war. In the 50th year of the war, the Book of the War, a guide to the first half-century of the war, was published. It contained a small entry on House Lolita, an obscure New Blood house which had then recently allied with House Dracolix. Godfather Morlock, head of the 11-Day Empire's bio-research wing, used a tracking knife to examine the corpse of Vlad III, also known as Vlad the Impaler or Dracula. Among several potential timelines, he saw one where, with the assistance of a woman named Lilith, actually Lolita, Dracula survived his trip to London and infiltrated the British Empire with a fashionable new breed of vampirism. This potential timeline was blocked off at the Ghost Point by a brigade of enemy TARDISes. Gideon stole the phonograph where Morlock described his findings, and with the help of the Loa, Auteur used it as inspiration for his writings. Around the 52nd year of the war, Lolita came to the 11-Day Empire with Ruth Ventra Colixa Baxil, claiming she wanted to reinstate Faction Paradox as a proper Time Lord house. Before arriving, she hired the 79th Sontaran Assault Corps to attack the Empire. After communing with the Loa, Lolita turned on her allies and swallowed Ruthven, and the Sontarans, and the Empire itself. The only survivors were Cousin Eliza and Cousin Justine, who escaped in Ruthven's TARDIS. Its main power base lost, Faction Paradox was left fractured. As Iris Wildtime put it, the ashes of the faction were scattered across the universe, the scant surviving members crawling into untraceable holes, biding their intangible blades until the pointless war concluded. Surviving groups included the inhabitants of the Shadowspire, Mother Mathara's army, and the Boulevard of Alternate Brutalities. There were also 3 separate faction groups, all unaware of each other, surviving in 21st century America, and multiple individuals wrongly believing themselves to be the last vestiges of the faction. With the faction out of the picture, the Time Lords began threatening the Osiran court. In response, Sutekh brought his armies of Malak to the area around the Mediterranean Sea in the 15th century, a crucial point in history. The Time Lords sent Meritria Elenia to influence the humans into destroying the Malak, but she was captured. The Time Lords were forced to agree to a peace treaty to keep history intact. In the treaty, they rededicated the Faction Paradox Shrine in Civita to Sutekh. After Sutekh killed his brother Osiris, he smashed the shrine's remembrance tanks and buried his corpse underneath. Osiris's biodata spread into the infant inhabitants of the tanks, upwards into the Tree of Filth, and out into the bugs of the hours, and throughout the Italian countryside. Corwin Marn and his wife Astarte took a baby from one of the tanks and adopted it as their daughter. After Lolita ended the 11-Day Empire, most of the other houses wanted to ally with her. With the War King's Gallifrey practically under her control, she began trying to expand her influence throughout the Spiral Politic. She planned to occupy millions of bodies in powerful positions on every important planet, in every time zone, controlling history like one great big nervous system. Lolita began with Earth in 1762, overlaying her identity on Queen Charlotte's mind, putting George III in a natural time envelope so that he wouldn't notice the changes in his wife, and importing from the 51st century an arming of Peking homunculi, keying to her central processor. Cousins Justine and Eliza came to 1762 and encountered Mary Culver, who was used by Compassion to inform them of Lolita's presence. With the help of Lord Sandwich and the Sieur d'Eon, Eliza destroyed the homunculus army, loosening Lolita's hold on the Era. Lolita also tried to take control of history in 21st century America, where, as Libertarian Arizona Congresswoman Lola Dennison, she orchestrated Matt Nelson's presidential campaign. While he still lost the Democratic Party nomination, as the patterns of the Spiral Politic would suggest, instead of his campaign dwindling, he founded the Radical Party and selected Lola as his vice presidential candidate. Lolita also gave Richard Francis Burton The 1002nd Night while he travelled in Arabia in the 1840s. The story contained a prophecy that would inspire Dave Larson to assassinate Nelson at his inauguration. At the time, several of the minor wartime powers had influences on 21st century Earth. There were at least 3 faction paradox groups, all unaware of each other, and the Celestis had control of one of the major governments. When the slope of Earth's history, which had been flat since the Ghost Point at the start of the century, started to bend upwards, either the Time Lords or the enemy sent an agent to investigate. The agent tracked the disruption to Nelson's campaign, but when Lolita discovered them, she turned them into a shift. The shift tried persuading Larson to kill Lola instead by telling him about Lolita's murders of young women along the campaign trail, but Larson only became more determined. After he killed Nelson, Lola Dennison became president and announced the Caldera Project, through which she intended to reshape history by drilling into the caldera hidden under the Earth's crust. The following Earth year, a number of books which had been buried since falling to Earth as a meteor in the 18th century were unearthed. They included the Infinite Book of Books, as well as the Faction Paradox series, a cache of entirely accurate books about the war which originated in another reality where it was fiction. Learning of this, multiple war powers, including the Time Lords, Faction Paradox, and Ashlar Shock Troops, descended on the New York Public Library to retrieve the books and the intelligence they contained. However, they were also sought out by people from 10,000 Dawns, including spies from the Great Assimilation and the Arbiter of Knives, a high-ranking member of the Firmament, who were to their reality as the Time Lords were to this one. The latter's agent, responsible for watching out for interlopers from beyond the war's universe, were bribed by the Arbiter to overlook events in the temporal orbit of Rachel Edwards, who was covering the book's discovery for her newspaper for a few days, allowing the Arbiter to gain entry to the library. There she incapacitated the War Powers agent, negating their ability to regenerate so long as she was in the room, with the exception of the Strid, an opportunistic body-snatching species who had reached the books first. In the end, however, Rachel prevented the books from being acquired by any of the parties present, forcing the interdimensional visitors to retreat. Before she left, Arbiter warned her that the Time Lords would probably track her down and erase her memory of these events. In expectation of this, she wrote them down and hid many copies in various places around her home and the city. In 1762, Sabbath Day was inspired by Cousin Justine's actions to perform a supplication ritual which transformed him into an agent of the Time Lords. Sabbath put Justine on trial for the crimes of Grandfather Paradox, sentencing her to finish the grandfather's sentence on Sharda. 6 months after Justine was imprisoned, Compassion possessed a guard and released Demetra Kine of the Blood Coteries to cause chaos through which Justine could escape. Kine took control of the prison and attempted to take revenge on Shunkucker, another surviving member of the faction. After teaming up with Shunkucker to kill Kine, Justine escaped in a TARDIS just before Time Lord soldiers arrived to disband the riot. In the time that Justine was in prison, a lot happened back on Earth in the 1760s. Before Justine left, Compassion had been convinced that a great fight would be needed to stop Lolita from taking over Earth. Justine returned in 1763. By the end of that year, she and Eliza were no longer in contact with Compassion, and no longer worried about Lolita taking over the 18th century. However, Compassion remained an active force in the war, in the 58th year bringing an end to the City of the Saved Civil War. At a time that the shift described as years in the future of the period covered by the Book of the War, a team of 12 Time Lords, including Zeneria, Holstrid and Alopta, were sent to Antarctica in 12 million BCE to prepare an assault on Planet 5 to capture the Fandal so that it could be re-engineered into a final assault weapon for the war. Because the Celestis had used a fictional generator to bring to life the Elder Things from H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, the Time Lords regenerated into bodies which resembled Elder Things to blend in. The Eighth Doctor, Compassion and Fitzkriner came to the Time Lord base to investigate the Elder Things. The Time Lords were about to break through the temporal barrier around Planet 5 by barraging it with kamikaze war TARDISes, but Compassion's presence inspired them to break free of their servitude. Takon tried to restrain the TARDISes with a DMAT gun and was forced to shoot the lead TARDIS, rupturing it. The damaged TARDIS spread into a time fissure stretching from 12 million BCE to 1999. In the 1970s, Professor Fendelman used the energy of this time fissure to reanimate the final fragment of the Fandal. The Fourth Doctor and Leela arrived at Fendelman's lab and prevented the Fandal from fully manifesting. They dumped the Fandal fragment in Cantharis, where, according to some accounts, it was found by the Daleks and re-encountered by the Eighth Doctor and Lucy Miller. Another indicated it drifted to Kaldor and caused its destruction, although the Eighth Doctor suspected that Livchenko's return to Kaldor changed history, and another account of that period of Kaldor history suggested that it was not destroyed by the Fendal. Freshly returned from a disastrous mission on Delphon, where he desperately tried to use his eyebrows to get the local Delphons to attack the enemy, Homunculus was sent by the War King to station himself in 1999, under the alias Nathaniel Hume, to investigate the fissure and other remnants of what was going on in 12 million BCE. Compassion and Holstrud followed the TARDIS to 1999, where they encountered Hume and fought too. Back in the past, the Eighth Doctor convinced all the TARDISes not to break the shield around Planet 5, but one TARDIS accidentally did, unleashing the Fendal Predator. Just as the Hermit planned, the Predator was attracted to Mictlan, home of the Celestis. The Predator feasted on the Celestis, utterly destroying them. The Doctor coordinated the TARDISes into working together to push Mictlan away from the main universe, so that the Predator wouldn't be able to return. The Shift, who attended the relic auction, managed to escape the dying Mictlan with several other Celestis servants by hijacking one of the TARDISes. They landed on a world at the beginning of the Spiral Politic, where the Shift eventually found its way into a copy of the Book of the War. Following the failed Fifth Planet Gambit, Zenaria was regarded as a war hero and given the honorary title of Zenaria Who Survived. In 1763, a group of Malak left over from Sutek's activity in the 15th century were led by Myrtra Elenia to Italy to use an Osiran lodestone to open a time tunnel to Upuat. Members of the Society of Sigismondo di Rimini summoned Justine and Eliza to help them deal with the Malak, and they successfully stopped Elenia. However, after Corwin Mon took Justine and Eliza to the defiled faction shrine in Civita, Justine allowed Myrtra to open the corridor, and she herself travelled through it to the ship of 1 billion years. Eliza collected fragments of Osiris's scattered biodata, while as a diplomat in the Osiran court, Justine recruited Anubis to build a new body for Osiris with a remembrance tank. Lolita told Sutek about Justine's plan, and he sent the ship of 1 billion years to destroy them at Anubis's laboratory. Realizing that she had run out of time to collect the final pieces of biodata, Eliza sacrificed herself to become the host for Osiris's resurrection. However, since the Time Lord diplomat Mortega was also being threatened, the War King rescued them with the 59th Time Fleet. During this confrontation, Lolita snuck into the laboratory and contributed some of her own biodata to the resurrecting Osiris. Osiris's resurrection within Eliza's body was complete, and he was accepted by the Osiran court as Horus. Horus overpowered Sutek using his power derived from Lolita's biodata, as Lolita planned to rule the Osiran court through Horus. The War King brought Justine back to Gallifrey and tried to give her House Paradox's old seat on the War Council, but Lolita challenged the War King's judgment, rallying public support behind her. As Justine fled Gallifrey, Lolita devoured him and became War Queen. The War King would later attempt to escape Lolita's interior using Sabbath Day, but did not succeed. After Sutek and Horus both agreed that the Osiran throne would go to the victor of a time war, Justine and Horus worked together to capture Sutek and Lolita in a temporal trap that ended with Sutek's imprisonment in a pyramid and Horus's death after using his army of 700 Osirans to deal with Lolita. After this, he told Justine that she would no longer be a problem for them. Indeed, this time war was partially fought on 18th century Earth, where Compassion previously predicted the last stand against House Lolita would be made. Justine found a new home for Faction Paradox in the aftermath of Elizabeth Hawkins and James Braddock's experience in Shrines. When inducting his earlier self into the faction, Francis Burton made himself swear by Horus, the reborn child from whose sacrifice the faction owes its rebirth. The Nambiro developed a taste for paradox energy after their home planet was drenched in the fallout of a ruptured TARDIS, leading them to begin hunting down the members of the faction. After capturing some Nambiro to learn of their motives and capabilities, the faction decided to fight the Nambiro traps with a larger trap of their own, the Armistice. Faction agents, disguised as acting troops, were sent across the galaxy to spread news of the peace. One such troop, consisting of Mullion, Amara, Axis Diaski, Hole, and Kabe Mao, were tasked by their elders with reconstituting 3 individuals by speaking their words. The words were actually from the troops' personal future, when they were torn apart by internal conflict and the survivors were killed by Nambiro. The faction also experimented with technology to alter the perceptions of millions at once, using a remote colony world. This secret project was overseen by Satyavan, who had ulterior motives in resurrecting his civilization of origin, which was erased from time. Satyavan refused to report of the technology's success to the faction, and many faction agents were sent to the planet and killed by remote. Mers investigated, and learned that Satyavan was the pawn of lost souls resembling shadows who had been erased from time and wished to return, and took his place as overseer. Mars was left in temporal turmoil by the battle between Sutekh and Horus, as well as experiments by the Time Lords and the influence of the Book of the Enemy. As a result, the Ice Warriors found themselves fighting for historical existence. Several were recruited by Faction Paradox, including Gustav, who fled from the chaos of Mars. Thousands of Life's Angels began spreading news of the war's end to mortals and immortals alike, at one point appearing before Intrepid, Kiffer and Gustav at the Shadow Spire. Sometime after this, the Battle of Kratoski Fields was fought. Cortalian held the first auction in heaven on Krakoum, which ended in chaos when Kiffer and Gustav unleashed the frozen Battle of Kratoski Fields, and Auteur tried to become beyond time by merging with a Pep. Sponsored by the Nambiro, Huxley sent Wade, Nez, Tambril Savora Vitas, and a shift to the Time Lord base on RMS in the Amazolian system to steal the Greater Key, where they all died in an encounter with an enemy conceptual predator. A Nambiro the faction had trapped in a dead time containment field on Dust was released and tricked by cousin Persephone into seeking the Book of the Peace. The Nambiro arrived in a faction-made simulation based on the Yeag letters and encountered a foe William Burroughs. Prevented from extensively examining the Book of the Peace by Burroughs, the Nambiro was left convinced the armistice was real, even though it knew no details. It returned back to its people, who then believed that with the war over, Faction Paradox were the last remaining source of Paradox energy. The faction proceeded to hold a ritual to get all its members to gather on Dust, so the Nambiro would swarm there. While the Nambiro were distracted, Zakobo Agi harnessed the power of the Paradox Eater to change the Nambiro's history so that they never came to hunger for Paradox energy. The Nambiro and Dust all became paradoxes themselves, and destroyed each other in the storm of cannibalization. Thus, the purpose of the armistice was fulfilled. At a time towards the end of the war, when it had been going on for around 292 years and the Celestis were long dead, there arrived a militaristic faction Paradox war fleet led by Mathara, coming from the destruction of the 11-Day Empire in the war's past, bringing with them a piece of the Empire and a false Grandfather Paradox. To be precise, he was a version of the Eighth Doctor, completely changed by the biodata virus, who took on the title of Grandfather Paradox. The Time Lords of this era were losing the war. On one Gallifrey, misinformation camps and carefully detonated reality bombs were used to obscure certain truths from the majority of Gallifreyans. Biological defences created in ancient Gallifreyan history to combat the Great Vampires and the Charon were augmented to have devastating capabilities against the enemy. The faction Warfleet travelled to Romana III's Gallifrey just before the start of the war, at the same time that Compassion was forcibly taken to the planet with the Eighth Doctor and Fitzkriner inside of her. The pre-war Eighth Doctor was on the verge of being overtaken by the faction biodata virus at that time. The faction successfully took the capital by force. They resurrected Greyjan the Sane using a remembrance tank, and had him take Romana's place as Lord President. The nature of Greyjan's previous presidency meant that Gallifrey began merging with the 11-Day Empire. Using their newfound control over the web of time, the faction began altering the history of Romana's Gallifrey, erasing 5 of the 6 founders of Time Lord Society, and undoing the creation of the 8 copies of Romana's Gallifrey. But there was one variable that the faction did not account for: the Doctor's original TARDIS, previously devastated by Lolita in the events that led the Doctor to start travelling in Compassion, containing within it the potentiality of the timeline where the Third Doctor regenerated due to radiation from Metebelis 3, and was never infected with the biodata virus. The stress of containing this timeline warped the TARDIS, turning it into the vast edifice which loomed in the sky above Gallifrey. The Eighth Doctor journeyed into the heart of the edifice, where he had a confrontation with Grandfather Paradox. The Doctor chose to use the unstable power of the edifice to restore the Metebelis timeline and erase Romana's Gallifrey from history, to spare its inhabitants from the rule of Faction Paradox and the horrors of the war. The ensuing explosion eradicated the entire sector of space containing Kasterborous, and with it the Faction Warfleet. All the surviving Time Lords of the destroyed Gallifrey either fled to other clone worlds or fell from the war to be among the lesser species, their timelines rotting and their second hearts decaying due to their connection to a dead world. Compassion rescued the Eighth Doctor, Fitz and Nivet from the destruction of Gallifrey. She believed that this meant the war was over, but would have significant further involvement in the war. The Eighth Doctor then lived through a century on Earth, after which he and Fitz found themselves in a post-war universe. Multiple later incarnations of the Doctor would go on to have further involvement in the war, further tangling the timelines. The faction Paradox Warfleet crumbled out of the spiral politic, but survived as clockwork temporal viruses. At an earlier point in his timeline, the Eighth Doctor found himself in the war era and tried to send a hypercube to his Gallifrey for help with the boy. A member of faction Paradox in 2002 San Francisco. While the Doctor believed that hypercubes were impossible to intercept, the boy did just that. When asked how he did it, the boy replied, "Maybe there's no one home on Gallifrey. Or maybe the whole planet's being destroyed, undestroyed, and destroyed, and you just caught them at the wrong moment." At a time when the Time Lords had been fighting the war for half a millennium, the Time Lord military was on its last wave, but this time the original Gallifrey was known to have been wiped from existence, along with most of its population. In this era, the High Council sent Homunculate on Marie on a mission to obtain the relic, so its biodata could be examined to further the war effort. Homunculate saw the relic as the final chance to win the war. After first encountering the Black Man in 2169 London, they went to Quixote's auction, where they failed to secure the relic. With no other options, the Time Lords adopted a strategy of mutually assured destruction. They created Anathema, a planetary warship with the cold at its centre, designed to destroy Earth, the enemy's supposed planet of origin, in the late 20th century, and therefore destabilise the causal nexus of the universe. In order to get past the enemy defences, Anathema was sent to Earth not with time travel, but with sublight-speed space travel along a 3 billion year route from a Time Lord base. The Time Lords then evacuated the universe. Compassion heard rumours involving something about a universe in a bottle. In fact, they stole I.M. Foreman's bottle universe while the Eighth Doctor was visiting her. There were already Time Lords in Foreman's bottle universe, who evacuated into their own bottle universe when the gods of Della began taking over their universe. Christine Summerfield theorised that the gods were actually the Time Lords from the universe outside Foreman's bottle universe. However, other sources indicated that the gods were actually the Ferritu, and that the universe invaded by the gods was the same one in which the war occurred. As the warship began nearing the end of its 3 billion year journey, faction Paradox of an earlier period in the war established a remote colony on the warship. When Anathema finally did reach Earth, it was disarmed by the Eighth Doctor. Entaradora believed that the war would be ended by either the entire war's retroactive annulment, or a victory for one side so complete that it would become true history. By one account, the war was retroactively annulled by the Eighth Doctor, erasing Romana III's Gallifrey from history. However, in the post-war universe, there was still evidence that the conflict had lasted many generations. Some members of the Time Lords believed that the war would end after the 7 prophesized heads of Severance spoke. In a deleted scene of Majun, the Ghost Kingdom, Baron Amatsumara said, "When the 7th head speaks, the war will end, and the true war will begin." In the Book of the Truce, Godfather Morlock wrote that the war could be ended by placing all of its participants in Oxbow realities. Some optimistic thinkers thought that the war would resolve itself if only a few key figures were trapped in Oxbow realities. On the 18th of March 2005, Madame Blavody warned Panda, "The war is ending. It will be happening soon, or recently, or always has." According to one tour operator who took advantage of Gallifrey's fall from grace to organise time tourism into its history, the war in heaven was similar in nature to the monk's description of a change war, a conflict where both participants constantly went back and rewrote their entire part in the war, meaning it had no fixed history or conclusion, except that instead of staying static, the war was constantly getting shorter. This process became complete in the span of time between the tour operator beginning to explain it and then finishing, forcing them to cancel all tours of this era of Gallifreyan history. When the Eighth Doctor emerged from his century-long exile on Earth after destroying Romana III's Gallifrey, he discovered that Gallifrey and the Time Lords had now been completely wiped from history. Despite this, there still existed 4 remaining Time Lords, though they were forced by their new circumstances to remove their second hearts that were connecting them to their disappeared world. Several other groups from the war survived its ending, including Faction Paradox and the Mayakai. While there were only 4 elementals, as they were dubbed, the Doctor encountered other Gallifreyan survivors such as Chloe, Erasmus, and Marnell. It was implied that Romana had managed to survive and live on to regenerate a 4th time, despite the obliteration of her Gallifrey. After the destruction of Gallifrey, temporal tourism into earlier years of its history became popular, though it was a risky hobby. Tourism into the war era itself was inadvisable, however, and increasingly difficult as the war kept reiterating and looping on itself as the Time Lords and the enemy tried to undercut each other, becoming shorter and more violent each time. Emboldened by their new knowledge, several groups or individuals went so far as to try to fill the void left by the Time Lords by seizing control of history, a race for the throne of time, if you will. The Onia scavenged fragments of time travel technology for thousands of years in their quest to discover the secrets of it and become the Lords of Time. Sabbath Day stole the Eighth Doctor's second heart to gain some Time Lord abilities, and he planned to use them to replace Gallifrey and the Time Lords with Earth and humanity. In their own quest to become the new Lords of Time, the Council of Eight eliminated their enemies from their fortress in the Time Vortex by manipulating both Sabbath and the Doctor. However, they were defeated by the Doctor working together with Sabbath and Miranda, the daughter of the Emperor of the four surviving elementals. The Daleks, often previously assumed to be the enemy, rose to prominence in the Time Lord's absence, crossing paths with the Doctor, Fitz and Trix several times. They monitored the Council of Eight's affairs and watched the destruction of the Time Station, plotting how they could take advantage of events for their own ends. The Doctor foiled their attempt to exterminate the Pope of 2097 on a visit to Mars, a crucial nexus point of human history. After suffering from amnesia for several years, the Eighth Doctor foresaw, and encountered evidence of, a distant future of the post-war universe in which, although Gallifrey was not restored, he and the other Time Lords regained control of the universe and attempted to stabilize it. Assembled as the Imperial family, the four surviving elementals ruled over all of time and space from the Needle. The identities of the four were the Emperor, really the Doctor, the man with the rosette, really the Master, the man with the bent nose, really the Minister of Chance, and the woman with long blonde hair, really either Romana or Iris Wildtime. The Clade blamed them for draining the universe of energy by starting the war, and after several centuries of conflict, the Clade revolted and overthrew the family. However, this did not stop at the end of the universe. By the time Miranda Dawkins became Empress of the Needle, there were no stars left in the sky, and the energy drain left everything in a dying void. In the time of the Empress, the universe was still a grey void, and all surviving planets were freezing cold. Entire sections of the universe and its timeline were simply missing. The boy from Faction Paradox had once told the Eighth Doctor a greyness would fall over reality around the time of the Needle. The Infinity Doctor saw the Needle was the final structure of life in a grey starless void. The Council of Eight were the most successful of the post-war era's new powers in creating their own web of time. Their manipulations took advantage of reality's instability to investigate a multiverse collapse, which briefly led to the Council's timeline as the only reality in existence. Once the Doctor's amnesia had cleared, he realised that in the last moments before he destroyed Gallifrey, he had deleted his memories and downloaded the Matrix, including the minds of all the Time Lords. Marnell made him promise to restore the Time Lords and build a city for the saved, and to this end, the Doctor sent K9 to Espero. There, Madame Jing had previously offered to restore his memories, something which the Doctor had now realised would cause the Matrix in his mind to be deleted unless he managed to restore it first. Despite this risk, Marnell believed the Doctor would go on to make good on his vow. Indeed, the Eighth Doctor had previously glimpsed in the Tomorrow Windows a possible future in which the Time Lords were restored along with their homeworld. Also among his possible futures, albeit one less certain than the timeline where he became the commonly accepted Ninth Doctor, was a timeline where he was known to become a listless-looking man. This possible version of the Ninth Doctor coexisted with a version of the Master, both of them flying their TARDISes freely and believing the universe to be secure enough that the Doctor could consider retirement. According to some accounts, the faction in the war who'd created the Quedgen, the Time Lords, indeed survived beyond W-time and returned to having great influence over the universe from Gallifrey. Now calling themselves the Superiors, they inaugurated the new era of V-time and eliminated their wartime enemies' lingering influence on reality via a surgical procedure on the regen imp soldier Chris Quedge. When the Eighth Doctor looked into the Tomorrow Windows, he saw that his most probable future was to become a Ninth Doctor with big ears and a hawk-like face. When this Ninth Doctor met Rose Tyler, he recounted to her how he was the last of his kind following a time war, with the Doctor having been forced to destroy his planet to put an end to said war. The 10th Doctor continued to consider himself the last of the Time Lords, recounting to Martha Jones how his planet was gone. Although most accounts depicted these events in the Doctor's life as following on from the last Great Time War against the Daleks, with the Doctor's destruction of Gallifrey under discussion having occurred in circumstances involving a weapon called the Moment, at a time when Rassilon's High Council were in charge of Gallifreyan forces, one account showed that the memory of Gallifrey's destruction at his hand, which haunted the 10th Doctor, was the 8th Doctor's memory of destroying Romana's Gallifrey, not the 8th Doctor's destruction of Rassilon's Gallifrey or the War Doctor's. Historians who studied the Daleks understood that the Time War had rewritten the history of the universe such that it was not the same as the one that had first felt the winds of change. The 9th Doctor also declared the universe we knew was gone after the Time War. The war had thrown up a bewildering jumble of alternate realities and superfluous timelines, such that no one could tell what had actually happened and what was now fantasy. With the war time locked away from reality, even the events of the conflict itself seemed uncertain. For the surviving Daleks, everything they had ever known was in flux, their past having changed forever. With many changes to time, the Time Lords were unable to remember the full story of the Time War, with one author writing that nobody was certain how the conflict even began. The 13th Doctor admitted she was unable to remember much of the War Doctor's life, though much of that could have been from the shame of it. While numerous accounts indicated the post-war universe and the multiverse based around it was the only reality in existence, this was not necessarily the case. When exposed to anti-time, the 8th Doctor of the Positive Time universe saw a prime universe where the Time Lords had ceased to exist. Time wound backwards to eliminate their every trace. Additionally, he described seeing a planet Earth where he plucked out one of his own hearts. One lower indicated that the War in Heaven timeline had not actually been erased when Gallifrey was destroyed, and the existence known to the surviving elementals was a result of them falling from the War in Heaven, crashing to the lesser species and having their timelines rot into thorned patchworks of broken memories. And that was the War in Heaven, a conflict I still even now don't fully understand, and I don't really think that you're meant to. Compared to the gritty sci-fi of the Time War, this is fantasy, with death cults and blood rituals, not cold hard technology, and that's the beauty of it. The war will never truly end. Thanks to the efforts of Archbeetle and others, stories within it will continue to be told, and this video will become outdated very quickly. But that doesn't mean it'll be untrue. The foundational stories are still there, and they're the ones that make up the most of the war, the most major of pieces. But anyways guys, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, then consider leaving a like and subscribing down below, as it really helps out the channel. And if you do subscribe, then make sure to click the little bell and turn on notifications so you're notified when more of my videos come out. But as always, thanks for watching.